Well, tens of thousands of protesters have taken to the streets in Israel in the biggest civil unrest since the beginning of the Hamas war. Today, the country is at a standstill amid a general strike. It was called after the IDF recovered the bodies of 6 hostages from an underground tunnel in Rafah. Fury at Hamas is a given, but Hamas is not the focus of these protests. The anger is directed at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who's accused of blocking a ceasefire and hostage release deal to save his own political life. Douglas Murray spent 6 months in Israel covering the war in Gaza, writing and broadcasting extensively in defence of Israel's actions. This summer, he faced his latest brush with cancel culture after racially charged riots caused havoc in Britain. And I'm delighted to say he joins me now to discuss all this. Douglas, great to have you back on Uncensored.
Hey, really good to see you again, Piers. It's been too long.
It has been too long. You're my first guest since the summer break. So much has gone on, not least in Israel with this war with Hamas. A massive development, obviously, over the weekend with the killing of 6 hostages by Hamas. As it's believed, the IDF were moving in to try and rescue them. First of all, your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, nobody can be particularly surprised by now about the brutality of Hamas, but I think still people are shocked. I think everyone's shocked that they would be holding on to hostages for almost a year in tunnels underground, making them undergo who knows what amount of torture and deprivation, only then to kill them maybe hours before they were going to be rescued by the IDF. You know, one of them was an American citizen as well. I think there's a lot of questions in America about how it could be that an American citizen could be held hostage and then brutally executed like this. But yes, I mean, this is what Hamas does. And by the way, all the people who said, that Israel shouldn't go into Rafah, that they shouldn't go any further south, as I think I said to you before, Piers, months ago, of the 2 aims in this war that the Israelis have to destroy Hamas and to get the hostages home, it was clear a long time ago that the hostages had been taken south, precisely to Rafah and other places there. And this is why the IDF has moved in. This is why they've been fighting all these months.
The interesting development in Israel itself is the very angry reaction towards Benjamin Netanyahu. A lot of people in Israel saying, look, we understand the need to get rid of Hamas. We want to get rid of Hamas, but our biggest priority is getting the rest of these hostages out. There are believed, I think, to be 97 hostages unaccounted for, of which 33 are feared to have been killed, which leaves 64 or so who may still be alive there. And the question that many are asking in Israel is, are they all going to get killed as Netanyahu continues to prosecute the war in which he's doing so? And if that is the case, then shouldn't there be a hastening of a peace deal of some kind?
The thing is, Piers, is that, I mean, public sentiment, public mood at such times is obviously incredibly febrile.
Hamas's savagery knows no bounds. 6 hostages slaughtered in underground hellholes moments before their rescue after being held captive for almost a year. Israel's twin mission is to crush Hamas and save captives, but Netanyahu faces public fury as families scream for hostage rescue. The Rafah assault is necessary, despite global outcry. But we must ask, is the war's relentless advance worth the possible ruthless sacrifice of innocent lives?
It's so grotesque that these poor young people should have been so close to being rescued only to be executed by Hamas. My view is that, it's understandable. There's grief and there's outrage in Israel. But, it is very important, like with some of the headlines worldwide. We had CNN and the BBC and others in recent days reporting the murder of these hostages as though they sort of died of natural causes and their bodies were then rescued from the tunnels. What happens in these situations, in my view, is that because there's very little, really, that the public can do, certainly in Israel, to pressure Hamas. I mean, Hamas does what they want, and what they want is genocidal. But, it is possible to pressurize a democratically elected government. And we've seen that in our own country. We see that around the world. If there's a group that you can do nothing to persuade, and somebody else who is vulnerable to persuasion, or at least to political and democratic pressure, you know, it's quite commonplace that you would focus on the second. I just think that it's worth remembering that, as far as I understand it, the stumbling block in the negotiations has been the issue of the Philadelphia corridor, which is the Gaza-Egypt border. And just very quickly, the reason why that matters as an issue, and why, as I understand it, it's such a sticking point in the negotiations is, of course, the Egypt-Gaza border is where the rockets have been smuggled in from for years into Gaza, where much of the munitions and guns and much more has been smuggled in. And Israel, as I understand it, is simply trying to make sure that that corridor is no longer able to be policed, as it were, solely by the Egyptians, but should also have Israeli oversight as well. I mean, that's a long-term issue, of course. People are focused on the short-term issue of the hostages, and that's quite understandable. But in the long term, if there isn't just going to be an endless Groundhog Day-like repeat of these wars in Gaza, it is necessary, as I see it, to stop Gaza being remilitarized after this war.
The problem internally for Netanyahu is that his own defense minister, Yoav Gallant, on Thursday got into a screaming argument with him during a cabinet meeting, specifically about the Philadelphia corridor. His belief, which many share in Israel, is that that is a deal breaker for Hamas for any kind of ceasefire deal that involves returning the hostages. And that whatever you think of Hamas, if you're trying to get to a position where those hostages are returned, then there's got to be some compromise here with Hamas. He says that if the Philadelphia corridor, which Netanyahu has made an absolute deal breaker his end in recent weeks, if that remains the case, then there's simply no chance of Hamas ever agreeing to any ceasefire deal to return the hostages. And there are concerns now internally, politically in Israel, that Gallant may well resign, and that may well potentially cause a fall of dominoes, which could end up with Netanyahu's government falling.
Well, again, I mean, politicians fall out all the time in Israel, like everywhere else. That's not surprising itself that Gallant and Netanyahu might be in disagreement on something.
Israel demands the Philadelphia corridor's control to cease endless weapon smuggling that have enabled Hamas to carry out these atrocious attacks and slaughtering of innocents. Murray denounces media whitewashing. These weren't natural deaths. They were murdered in cold blood. Israel now faces a tragic dilemma, a merciless choice between long-term safety and immediate human sacrifice. Meanwhile, Netanyahu clashes with Gallant, risking political collapse.
But again, I mean, I'd come back to this point. Asking Hamas to do something nice, asking Hamas to compromise, is not a very straightforward thing. You know, Sinwar himself, who planned and plotted the 7th of October, is an utter fanatic. And this is something, by the way, that we in the West have sort of forgotten about. We use the term fanatical to describe anyone about their football team as a supporter and so on. But a real fanatic, somebody willing to kill and die and doesn't care about that. And Sinwar, everything we know about him is that he is precisely of that type. We know that, I mean, there's an account in the New York Times last year of the Israeli doctor who saved Sinwar's life when he was in prison in Israel some 13 years ago or so now. His life was saved by an Israeli doctor. And Sinwar said to this doctor, he thanked him for saving his life, but he said to him, you know, one day, he said, currently you're strong, but one day you'll be weak, and then I'll attack. You know, one of the young people murdered by Sinwar and his forces on the 7th was the nephew of the doctor who saved his life. This is Sinwar. This is Hamas. You could literally save the life of Sinwar, and he'll still come back to kill you. Tell me that such a person is a reasonable negotiating partner.
Well, he's certainly he's a terrorist, and Hamas are a terror organisation. And I've completely concurred with you from the start of this that what they did on October the 7th was of such a heinous scale that Israel obviously had to respond with massive force as they've done. But you'll also be aware, as we head towards the first anniversary of what happened there, that this is an ongoing, increasing, massive problem worldwide for Israel and its reputation, because so many people, including the UK now under Labour government, they've just announced, as we're talking, they're going to suspend some arms sales to Israel. 30 of 350 licenses will be suspended due to a clear risk the weapons will be used by Israel in a way that could breach international law. So there is increasing pressure, as you know, around the world for this to get resolved. Increasing views expressed by many countries that what Israel's now doing it constitutes a war crime. And you and I have debated that many times. But do you not feel that something has to give here, that this has to get resolved somehow, and that the only way to do that is, as with all these situations, you have to eventually compromise in some way? And the problem for Netanyahu is that people think he is completely incapable of offering Hamas any compromise, and therefore there is no deal. So the families of the hostages still there, and hundreds of thousands of protesters in Israel on the street to Tel Aviv right now, they are of the firm belief that it's his own intractable position on this, which is not going to allow any kind of ceasefire to be achievable.
But there again, if I can say so, Piers, it's the same thing, which is the presumption that it's Netanyahu who is uncompromising.
Hamas's savagery knows no bounds. Sinwar, the bloodthirsty fanatic, vowed to slaughter the very doctor who saved his life, and then goes on to orchestrate the murder of the doctor's nephew. Can you fathom such evil? How can we expect compromise with monsters who repay mercy with murder? Global pressure mounts as the UK halts arms sales to Israel. Murray defends Israel's right to fight back.
We end up with this, again, because Netanyahu is a democratically elected leader, and so it's assumed that some pressure can be brought to bear on him. In my view, it is not Netanyahu who's uncompromising. It's Hamas that's uncompromising. They could have handed back the hostages last October. They could have not done this. I mean, they could have tried to build a state since 2005, when Israel withdrew from the Gaza, and handed the place over to them. Hamas could have used the billions of dollars and pounds and euros that British and European and American taxpayers gave them since 2006. They could have used those billions of dollars to build up Gaza. They could have made a booming, in the good sense of the term, Mediterranean paradise. They could have created wealth for their people. But you know what they did? They built down instead of upwards. They built a tunnel network bigger than the London Underground for all of those years, and they squirreled away the money, just like Yasser Arafat did before them, and they made themselves rich. Why was Ismail Haniyeh worth billions of dollars? Why does Khaled Mashal, why is he worth billions of dollars? Why are their children like princelings who live in apartment complexes in Doha? Because they took the money of Americans and Brits and Europeans and they took it for themselves and kept the people of Gaza in immiseration and poverty. There has been since 2005 a complete counterfactual of what could have happened. But the Hamas leadership didn't want that. They have said themselves they want to use Palestinian children and their lives in order to pressurize the world. These are fanatics. They want the death of their own citizens, in order to get world opinion turned against Israel. Again, how do you negotiate with that? The assumption always is in the West today, because we're so sort of fat and lazy in our expectation that peace is the norm, and that historically it's the norm. We're so full of our own expectations and presumptions that we always think that wars end by some kind of compromise and coming around the table, to use the cliche. They don't. Historically, most wars end because one side wins and one side loses. And one of the reasons, in my view, why there is this endless rounds of war in this region is because the Israelis are never allowed to win, and Hamas, in this case, are always allowed to draw. And I think that that is simply to set up the precursor for the next conflict. If Hamas come out of this with a fighting capability, then there will be another round of this war in a couple of years. So when David Lammy and others say what we need to have is a peace deal, I'd say on what terms? Everybody wants peace except for Hamas and the fanatics. Everybody else wants peace. All of these people in the south, these kibbutzniks and the party goers and others who were murdered on the 7th, all dreamed of peace with their Palestinian neighbors and brothers and sisters. Who stopped that peace being possible? Hamas, from 2005 and again to this very day.
Hamas has transformed Gaza into a hellhole of terror tunnels instead of a paradise. Billions in aid squandered, while Hamas leaders luxuriate in wealth, hoarding billions while Gazans suffer. The West's naive peace dreams fuel endless bloodshed. Israel's hands are tied, never allowed to crush these monsters. Peace-loving Israelis slaughtered on October 7th dreamed of harmony. How can peace prevail when Hamas thrives on chaos and destruction?
I want to play you a clip. This is from an Israeli podcast with Elon Levy that you did in March about, well, you seem to infer something about all Palestinians being complicit. I want to play the clip and then get your response to it.
I treat the Palestinians in Gaza in the same way I would treat any other group that produced a horror like that. They're responsible for their actions. They're responsible for their actions. They voted in Hamas knowing what Hamas are. They allowed Hamas to carry out the coup, killing Fatah and other Palestinians and dragging their bodies behind trucks in the West Bank, in Gaza.
Do you actually hold all Palestinians culpable then for what Hamas have done?
Well, all Palestinians aren't, as it were, free game just because of this. No, not at all. Of course not. And all their lives matter. The point I made there, and the point I've made for many years now, is that you cannot separate out completely the Palestinian people and their leadership. The leadership is there for a reason. They get elected, albeit they tend to have one election once and then just stay in power, as is the case with the PA in the West Bank, and as is the case with Gaza in Gaza with Hamas. I've had many conversations with many Palestinians over many years now, in which they have tried to say, well, look, you know, we don't like our leadership, or our leadership isn't good, but you know. The thing is, Piers, is that if you have a vote, for instance, and you vote for Hamas, then there are consequences to that. And for all of these years, Hamas has been ruling the Gaza. It would obviously be much better for the Palestinian people if they had not voted in a genocidal terrorist group as their government.
But there is a but. There's a but, Douglas. There's a but. And it says the majority of Palestinians actually did not vote for Hamas. They got 44% of the vote. So it's not true to say that the majority of Palestinians, or all of them, voted for this. They didn't. You know, more than half of Gaza, of the Palestinian people there, voted against these people. And you could also say that many others who voted for them might well have done because they were terrorized into doing so. And I just think that we've got to be careful, haven't we, about distinguishing between people who genuinely, vocally support Hamas and people who are either terrorized into doing so or who actually voted against them and have then seen their country dragged into an abyss. And I completely agree with you about everything you say about Hamas, and that absolutely no way can they have any power coming out of this. But to blame all Palestinian people, I think, is a big stretch.
I don't blame all Palestinian people by any means. But look, Piers, if you just take the situation in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas is, I think, famously, as the joke goes, something like 18 years into his first 4-year term in office, leading the Palestinian Authority. And he's the guy, by the way, who David Lammy and others see as being the more viable negotiating partner.
The Palestinian people deserve better, but they must also take responsibility. Palestinians aren't blameless victims. Hamas seized power with a mere 44% vote, yet they rule with an iron fist. Abbas, the so-called moderate, clings to power like a tyrant. Originally elected for only 4 years, he has been gripping onto power for 19 years. When will they stop coddling corrupt leaders and demand real democracy?
This man is less bad than Hamas, but so far away from being a good negotiating partner that, again, a deal that's been on the table for years, almost literally since 1948, he still can't come to the table on. This is the situation in the West Bank. I remember years ago, I was staying in Ramallah, And I was having meetings with young Palestinians and others, and they kept coming back to the same thing, which is, yes, these people are in power, but there's nothing we can do about it. And I remember once saying to one, you know, the problem is, whether it's Hamas in Gaza or the PA in the West Bank, all peoples who have been governed by terror entities like this are, of course, always themselves at risk. But the history of human liberation, apart from anything else, has always been people standing up to the tyrants who would rule over them and govern them. So when Hamas seizes control of Gaza after the election and kills the members of Fatah and others, they then make a deal with Fatah shortly afterwards, and then another one. So where is, you know, the fine art of this, Piers, is to find the very obvious blue water between Fatah and Hamas, but they keep on destroying that clear blue water and making it very murky indeed.
Okay, but you mentioned the West Bank. What about the aggressive expansion of the settlements that's been going on for the last year, which has been condemned by everyone, including the United Nations and others now? You know, that has been going on. A lot of Palestinian families are being either killed or uprooted or thrown out of their homes as there's this aggressive expansion of settlements, which is illegal. It shouldn't be happening. I don't think anyone could look at this and say what Israel has been doing and what Israelis are doing, these settlers there, is right and proper and legal. Would you defend that?
Well, look, I mean, the thing with the settlements, first of all, I mean, I regard it as being a second-order issue because, you know, there's a whole dispute about the settlements.
It's not to those who are being killed or displaced, is it?
Get into. Well, first of all, say they're being killed and displaced. There's a territorial dispute in the West Bank that you could see some of the borders. It would be as famously as Zippy Livni said, it would be the world's ugliest border. But you can see in the West Bank what a final status settlement could look like. I mean, it's there. There are areas where the Palestinians are more numerous, and there are areas where the Israelis are more numerous. And pretty much you can see with some land swaps what the carve-out would look like. But here's the thing. The reason why there isn't a final status settlement there is because of one thing, which is that it is not about whether or not Hahoma or other bits of East Jerusalem or the West Bank should have certain areas which should be made clear of Jews, which is, remember, that's the deal, that in a final status agreement, the Palestinian areas in the West Bank, just like Gaza, must have no Jews in them. That's the absolute baseline from which everything starts. That's what everyone's agreed on all sides. I don't know why, but that's the agreement.
The settlement issue is a smokescreen. The real cancer is Palestinian leadership's refusal to accept Israel's existence. The PA's moderate facade crumbles under scrutiny. They've rejected peace deals offering 93% of the West Bank. Hypocrisy reigns as Israel hosts 21% Arabs, yet Palestinians demand a Jew-free state. Israel's withdrawal from Gaza led to 4,000 rockets in 2021. How can peace thrive amid such relentless hostility?
But I would say it's not about that. Find out what Yahya Sinwar in Hamas, or Mashal, or any of the other leadership of Hamas in recent years, or the leadership of Fatah, what they actually want. And you see again and again, it is not about a settlement dispute on a hill somewhere in Samaria. It's about whether or not Israel has the right to exist from 1948 to this day or not. It isn't. Every single statement, and I can't stress this enough, from the Palestinian Authority of Fatah as well as Hamas, is that the Jews should be out of Haifa, that the Zionists should be out of Tel Aviv, that the Israelis must not be in Jerusalem. You see that they don't want an inch of this ground in this area to be governed by Israel and for Jews to be able to live in it. I wish that these people who have come to this mad situation, if they cared about their own people, an insane situation. I wish that that their forebears in 1948 had accepted the offer to have a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli state. I wish that at every point since, when a deal could have been made, whether it was at Camp David or many times since, I wish the Palestinian leadership had been had cared enough for the Palestinian people that they had accepted the offers on the table. But again and again, since 1948, they have said, no, we will sit this out, and one day the Israelis will disappear, and that's what we're holding out for. And that is the worst possible thing that they could have said to the Palestinian people, wherever they are, inside Israel, in the disputed areas, or in Gaza. The worst thing they have said to now several generations of Palestinians is, we will not accept 99% of a state if there is a Jewish state. That is the reason there is not peace today. That is the reason there is not a final status settlement agreement. It could have been there for decades, just like the Gaza. This could have been so different, and the responsibility for that, in my mind, does not sit on one Israeli prime minister or another, or a dispute in a war cabinet. It is on the fundamental inability and reluctance of the Palestinian leadership since 1948 and before to just accept that the Jews have the right to exist in their historic homeland and have a state which they can defend. And whether it's Mahmoud Abbas or Yahya Sinwar, they have spent all of these decades misleading their own people and leading them into precisely the situation of immiseration and now the horrors of Gaza that we see today. It is on that leadership and their failure of leadership, and it's a tragedy.
Douglas Murray obliterates the myth that the so-called settlements are blocking peace. Palestinian leaders, from Hamas to Fatah, reject Israel's very existence. They spurned a 2000 peace offer, granting 97% of the West Bank. Palestinian leaders have been feeding their people poison for decades. These so-called leaders would rather see their people suffer than accept a Jewish state. The blood of generations is on their hands.
Why is it then that so many, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets to blame Netanyahu? Not because they support Hamas or what they did or try to defend what they did or anything like that, no, but because they believe that Netanyahu massively dropped the ball with what happened October the 7th. It was a massive security failing for which he will be held accountable when this is over. He's facing corruption charges, which he will be held accountable for in court when this is all over, and he won't have the control of the judiciary or the military when that day comes. A lot of people in Israel now believe that Netanyahu is continuing to propagate this war for self-interested reasons, and they are taking to the streets in gigantic numbers now to express that anger because they believe that that is costing the lives of hostages.
As I say, I mean, they're on the streets out of grief, I think, first and foremost. I mean, grief and horror at the situation.
But could they be right, too?
Not least, Netanyahu,
could they be right with that narrative about Netanyahu, that actually it's not in his interest to end this war?
I mean, look, I think it's a sort of cynical and easy explanation that, as it were, the war is going on because Netanyahu simply wants to remain in power. He's already the longest-serving Israeli prime minister. So, I mean, I don't think he particularly needs to stay in power. We can look into the psychology of him, but there's not much point. And as for the trials and so on, we'll see what happens with that. But the thing that is surprising to me, as it were, again, is that people don't see that you can put pressure, exert pressure on a democratically elected leader very easily in any democracy. And that is where people tend to apply pressure because they have the right to. But as I say, we've been in this situation before in other democracies. We've had it in Britain as well. If there's nothing you can do about a terrorist group, it's quite commonplace to put the anger and level the blame at democratically elected leaders on whose watch things have happened. That's just inevitable, but it's one of the things that democracies have to be aware of when they're dealing with death cults like Hamas, is the death cults operate by a totally different standard than the standards of the democracies. And all of the difference in the world exists in that gap.
Final question about Israel before we move on to other topics. How does this end? You know, I've had guests on, pro-Israeli guests, who say this ends effectively with Israel controlling Gaza. as an occupying force. You know, Netanyahu has hinted at that. But that, of course, is completely unconscionable and unacceptable to any Palestinian. So how does this end?
Well, I mean, your guess is as good as mine, Piers. The stated objectives of Israel's war, as I say, to return the hostages and to destroy Hamas, which is, as I understand it, is to make sure that Hamas is operationally incapable. And by the way, they've had a very considerable success in that, not just of killing the leadership of Hamas, but among other things, also stopping the perpetual rocket fire, which has gone on for years from Hamas around Gaza into Israel.
Murray shreds the naive narratives. Israeli protests against Netanyahu are democracy's cry, not support for Hamas. Protesters are blinded by grief, missing the bigger picture. Critics ignore Hamas's vile human shields in schools and hospitals. Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, yet terror reigns. Israel's fighting a death cult. What's the alternative? Let terrorists run wild? This is war, not a PR campaign.
As the months have gone on since last October, instead of the daily air raid sirens that used to go on in major cities like Tel Aviv, there's now almost no rocket fire out of Gaza because Hamas has been made so operationally incapable. That's a point that very rarely gets brought out. It's not a small thing to stop rocket fire happening all the time against the civilian population. But as for how it ends, I don't see any appetite in Israel among almost any politicians or the public to have to continue or have to reoccupy Gaza. I don't know of any Israeli who is desperate to be in charge of making sure that Gaza is on a day-to-day basis running well and peaceably. It has been such a hell for such a long time. Whatever you think of Ariel Sharon's pullout in 2005, most people would look back at it now and say, look, the Israelis didn't want to have to be in control of the Gaza then. It was a perpetual nightmare. They withdrew, a new nightmare began. What the final agreement can be or the day after Hamas, it'll probably be, it should be, in my view, some kind of international effort, the basis of which you can kind of see, I think, some of the Gulf states, obviously not the terrorist sponsors in Qatar, but some of the Gulf states, the Emiratis and others have expressed an interest in being involved in some way. The Saudis will probably have to be involved, the Egyptians, the Jordanians. Maybe all of these people who express concern about the Palestinian peoples and who've done so little for them for so many decades could actually do something about that concern. Put money in, help with a peacekeeping force, help with a police force, and much more. The one thing that cannot happen is that Gaza is built back up under Hamas, and we have the same war in the same region a few years down the road. And so what it looks like the day after, I don't know. But, you know, that's the thing about wars. If you start a war, as Hamas did on the 7th, you don't know how it's going to end. The one thing that Israel knows is what is impossible to tolerate. And what is impossible to tolerate is a situation where Hamas has control of the Gaza again and continues to fire rockets again and then does October the 7th again and again as its leadership have said they wanted.